Let me thank the American Business Immigration Coalition for bringing us all together. Rebecca, thank you for your leadership. Mr. Rowe, thank you for your principled leadership. We will need it in this fight. And let me just say a word before I proceed to talk about the legislation about my dear friend, Luis Gutierrez. You know, when we were in these battles for immigration reform in the past, we would go to national meetings of various groups. And I never forget once in one of those meetings, one of the women yelled out, Gutierrez, Moises, the Moses of immigration reform. For those of you who know the biblical story of Moses, he led his people through the desert, ultimately to the promised land, but he didn't get to see the promised land himself because God was angry with him about something, so he didn't give him the final opportunity to see the promised land. Joshua, his disciple, ultimately led the Israelites into the promised land. And so my dear friend, who has been the Moses of immigration reform, has handed off this task to me, and I intend to be the Joshua that gets us all to the promised land. It's a new day in America. Los últimos 4 años han sido una pesadilla para los inmigrantes y sus familias. Esa pesadilla se termina hoy. The Biden-Harris administration, I believe, will get our government back into the business of solving problems instead of creating them. Our last president, unfortunately, took an opposite approach. From my perspective, he squandered billions on a futile border wall instead of addressing the root causes of migration. He tried to shut down DACA and NTPS for hundreds of thousands of people instead of recognizing their contributions to this country. And he instituted cruel policies that tore families apart instead of bringing people out of the shadows. Time to turn the page. Es hora de comenzar un nuevo capítulo. As a son of Cuban immigrants and the most senior Latino in the United States Congress, and someone who has spent years fighting for immigration reform, it means so much to all of us to have a new president propose bold and visionary immigration reform on day 1, not day 2, not day 3, not a year later, on day 1. As I prepare to introduce the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 in the Senate, I know that President Biden and Vice President Harris are going to be strong partners. They want to get it done, and we will get it done. Let me walk you through the legislation first. First and foremost, this legislation aims to bring 11 million people out of the shadows and onto a pathway of citizenship. Undocumented immigrants who pass criminal background and national security checks and pay their taxes will be able to apply for a new 6-year lawful prospective immigrant, or what we call LPI status. Lawful prospective immigrants will be authorized to work, to join the military, to travel, to live without the fear of deportation. And this will encompass both their spouses and their children, which means that from day 1, when you register with the government and you pass these essential elements of background, you have a temporary protective status, a lawful prospective immigrant status. After 5 years, they can apply for lawful permanent residency, or what most of us know as green cards. And dreamers, present TPS holders, and farm workers who meet specific criteria, they'll be eligible for green cards immediately. The bill also strengthens the family-based immigration system that has served America so well. The bill includes several provisions from the Reunited Families Act, which I introduced in the past Congress, along with several of my House colleagues. I've always believed that families are the foundation of our society. Las familias son el núcleo de nuestras comunidades. So I'm pleased that this legislation treats spouses and children of green card holders as immediate relatives, so they can immediately reunite with their families. And we eliminate discrimination against LGBTQ plus families. After 3 years, all green card holders are able to pursue naturalization and earn their citizenship. And while it may, to some, be a symbolic change, we remove the word alien from the immigration code and replace it with non-citizen. No longer will we dehumanize the undocumented. This legislation will also grow our economy, strengthen labor protections, and expand access to high-skilled workers. This bill includes many provisions from the POWER Act, my legislation to protect immigrant workers from retaliation for exercising their rights. And American companies will gain greater access to high-skilled workers. We clear out visa backlogs, we end country caps, we capture unused visas and enable more STEM graduates of our universities to stay here and put that knowledge to work for America. After all, we educate these individuals here. Some of them are the brightest people in the world, and then we send them away. No, we will have an opportunity to make sure that they put their knowledge to work for America. Finally, the bill resets our border security policies and restores our commitment to human rights. We will not steal money from our military to spend on a useless wall. We will not hire more border agents for the sake of hiring more border agents. We will not trample on our border communities, and we will not snatch children away from their parents. Instead, we will adopt smarter border controls. We will deploy new technology to help us manage the border, to combat transnational crime, to screen trade, travel, and detect narcotics and other contraband at every point of entry, and port of entry, I should say. And we will address the root causes of migration, particularly from Central America. We know that people do not flee their homes to seek asylum willingly. They are forced to do so and need safety. For many, their choice is to stay or die, or flee and have a chance of living. Stay and see their daughter raped, see their son put into a gang, or flee and take a chance at freedom. As the incoming chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I am incredibly pleased that this bill also includes provisions from the Securing the Northern Triangle Act to improve democratic governance and the rule of law, to fight corruption, to alleviate poverty, and crack down on transnational crime, human rights abuses, and gender-based violence. We also establish refugee processing locations in Central America, and we bring back the Obama administration's Central American Minors Program so that young people in harm's way can apply for asylum abroad instead of making the dangerous journey to the United States. For migrants who do arrive here, the bill improves accountability and training for CBP and ICE officers and develops basic minimum standards of care for individuals and children in custody. And we finally address the shortfalls in our immigration courts that undermine justice for the most vulnerable. Our immigration courts are overburdened and under-resourced. That's why we will hire more immigration judges and personnel and save taxpayer dollars by adopting more humane alternatives to detention, which have been proven to be just as effective. And we will no longer force children to make their own case for asylum on their own. We will give them the assistance to do that. Now, there's a lot more to the legislation, but I hope I have given you a solid glimpse into this bold and forward-leaning bill. Of course, as someone who has been in these battles for nearly 2 decades, I'm under no illusions. I know from my time in the Gang of Eight that passing immigration reform through the Senate particularly is a Herculean task. But in 2013, when we did that, as part of the Gang of Eight, we were told it would never happen. We ended up getting 67 votes for our legislation then, that then went to the House of Representatives, which unfortunately at that time Speaker Boehner never gave the bill a chance of even a vote. and it died in the House of Representatives. We start with a different process. We start with a president who has made this a priority on day one and who I believe will put political capital on the table to make it happen. We start with a majority, albeit slimmer, in the House of Representatives and a speaker who I believe is committed to immigration reform. In the Senate, I'm also humble enough and have the humility to understand and have worked. I have a history of having a bipartisan legacy here in the Senate, of working with many of my Republican colleagues to achieve incredible legislation, from foreign policy initiatives to Alzheimer's, to dealing with those children who have autism, and all of those major initiatives. I've worked with Republican colleagues. I believe that we can do so on immigration reform. Now, the reality is that under the Senate procedures, we will need 60 votes to achieve passage of this legislation. With every Democrat voting for the legislation and Vice President Harris as the president of the Senate voting with us, that gives us 51. That means we will need to find at least 9 Republicans who will join us in this historic effort. Now, we got more than that in 2013. Of course, time and circumstances have changed. Some of those Republican leaders are no longer with us, like the late John McCain or Senator Flake, who joined us in that effort. But I believe hopefully others will be able to step up to the plate. But it's important, I believe, that we start this conversation from a position of strength to advance a bold vision for immigration reform. So let me close by saying to my friends in the business community, we need you to give it everything that you've got. We need you to make it clear through your words and your actions and your dollars that you will not lend your support to politicians or platforms that stoke fear, spread xenophobia, and stymie prospects for reform. To my friends in the advocacy and labor communities, we have our work cut out for us. We must make the case for immigration reform, not just for immigrants and their families, but to Americans of all walks of life. It's time to put political capital and every other capital on the table to make this happen. And when we speak about capital, I think there is a moral imperative. I think there is a national security imperative. But for those who aren't moved by either of those imperatives, let me make the economic imperative. If we looked at the 2013 reform legislation that the Gang of Eight put through the Senate, the CBO economists at that time, those are the congressional budget officers who ultimately, nonpartisan, score everything the Congress does. Does it cost money? Does it save money? Is it revenue neutral? They projected that the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill would have reduced the national deficit by $850 billion over 20 years. That would have grown our economy by nearly $1.5 trillion within a decade, and that it added nearly $300 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund. DACA recipients and their households together pay $5.6 billion in federal taxes each year. TPS holders, who the previous administration would have removed, would have cost the country $45 billion in GDP for a decade. Foreign-born workers contribute roughly $2 trillion to our economy every year. And how about the undocumented workers we found them to be the essential workers, those who risked their lives so that the rest of us could stay at home, as we were told to by our government, to try to break the back of the pandemic, who pick our produce, who pack our meat, who keep our food supplies strong. The immigrants across every industry who may not have had legal status, but nevertheless paid $32 billion in taxes each year, and if given a path to citizenship, would likely add 1.4 trillion to the national GDP. Now, that was 2013. I believe that when it comes time to score these numbers with the new realities, those numbers would even be greater. So throughout our history, immigrants have enlivened our economy. They have unlocked innovation. They have unleashed prosperity, and they have set us apart as the greatest experiment in the history of the world. No other country on earth is as rich a constellation of families who hail from all over the world, but share a thirst for freedom and for opportunity. Immigrants always have and always will be our country's greatest believers in the American dream. I know it because I've lived that dream. I know that my friend, Vice President Harris, has lived that dream. And as I look forward to working with her and President Biden and with my colleagues and all of you to build a 21st century immigration system that keeps the promise of that dream alive for generations to come, that's what compels us to do it. Sí se puede y sí lo vamos a lograr.